All right, hey everybody, this is Patrick King with the Poison Pen. I am the science fiction fantasy selector here over at the Bookstore, and we are really, really lucky to have one of my favorite authors I've been reading since the very beginning, and that is Daniel Suarez, author of Damon, Freedom, Change Agent, and for this book, Delta V. He's written quite a few other novels as well. He's done some fabulous TED Talks, spoken with Google, and done some other really interesting projects along this side. I want to give a really warm welcome to Daniel Suarez.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Delta V, congratulations. This is a book that's been a long time coming, hasn't it?
Yeah, it was at least 2.5 years of work, maybe even 3 if I'm thinking honestly. But this was a passion project. I started work on this a few years back, and then realizing that it was literally rocket science, I decided to stop for a while and do Change Agent, which was genetic editing, as if that was much simpler. But I finished that, and then I came back to Delta V.
And yeah, I'm thinking about this because you're right, rocket science, but genetic editing. So you talked a lot about CRISPR, for instance, within the Change Agent.
Yeah.
So that's really an easy subject to kind of wrap your mind around
very quickly. Yeah, that was another one where I start by reading 24 books, all of which are hard. One of the good things about the point I am in my career is I can actually Google experts, and then they'll check me out and see that I'm very serious about writing this story. They know reasonably it's going to turn into a book, and so I can get a conversation with them at least and try to get some advice. One of the more interesting people I had who helped me with that book was the chief forensic person in Orange County who did all of the DNA evidence examination. And I learned so much from talking to him. Really fascinating person.
It's amazing what you can think about in terms of working with DNA and how fast it has grown, how fast science has changed. And I'm sure from the time that you started writing Delta V, about 6 years ago or so, to what it is now, that science has just kind of bounded forward.
Yeah, it has. And here we talk about the staging of a book or the production of a book. So I did several years of research off and on. So the actual writing of this book is very recent. And I don't know how many people here write, but I find, and of course this is different for everyone, I find that it's a breakdown typically of more research than normal for this book, but typically 1/3 of the time it's research, and 1/3 of the time is building the story, structuring it, developing the characters, and then the final third is actually writing the book. So that's 2/3 of it is really prep work, for me at least.
And what does that prep work look like for you? Is it primarily just reading, or are you plotting the outline as you're going along?
It's a little of both. Like I said, that first third, the research, I will typically, so for a book like Delta V, I knew typically there's an idea that just won't let me go. That's what determines what I'm going to work on. So I have several ideas that are, let's say, bothering me or nagging at me, that there's something that I want to learn or communicate about them. Typically, for me, it's because I think they're going to be important. And for those here who are familiar with my books, you know that I generally write about technology that I think is about to change our lives.
Right.
There's something about that has always fascinated me. I've worked in technology for 22 years before this. I worked in software development for big corporations. I spent about 22 years writing logistics software and other things like that. So some very intense stuff. And I could see how it was really changing society. And that's where Demon came from, was out of that. And I wrote about what I knew. And I love doing a deep dive of research to find out the details of some new thing, like Kill Decision, which was my 3rd book. Lethal autonomy, the idea of robots algorithmically determining whether or not to open fire on somebody. This is a very big and serious moral issue to me. I didn't see that it was getting enough attention in the popular media, and so I tried to make it more accessible so people could understand what those issues are. And of course, you wrap an exciting story around it. You try to make it as real as possible, and that just adds all these different dimensions to the story, so that when they read it and they say to themselves, yeah, but could that really happen? And then they man the Google and they start doing a search and they realize, oh my gosh, it is happening. And then hopefully when people see legislation and other things coming down the pipe, they're more informed about it as a person. They know what the issues are. Because technology has accelerated change so fast that sometimes it's difficult to keep up. So in that sense, that's partly what I do is I come upon an idea that won't let me go. And in the case of Delta V, it was commercial space. The idea that at some point we're not going to be doing sovereign journeys of exploration into space. It's going to be businesses going out there in the same way that it occurred in the first age of exploration, let's say between 1400 and 1600 AD. You had these initial journeys, let's say by the Portuguese and the Spanish, to go explore the world. These were primarily financed by sovereigns, but very close on those were people doing investments to say, hey, now that we know what the shape of the world is, what do we do with that information? And of course some really bad things followed that, because of course there were indigenous people living in those areas. Fortunately for space, we are probably not going to be dealing with natives up there, indigenous peoples, and it will be a radiation blasted void that we can hopefully imbue with some life and some economic activity, some commerce, because wherever human beings go, we bring commerce. So it was really that idea I wanted to explore. How do we close that chasm? How do we bridge it? Because for all of my life, this has been a sci-fi concept in the distant future, and enough people that I'd met from the course of my other books, people who worked in aerospace, the occasional billionaire who were doing things in space, I realized this is not science fiction anymore. I mean, sure, aspects of it are science fiction, but they're not necessarily far in the future. We could be doing them now, literally now. And so I wanted to tell a really authentic, present-day space story.
We've got billionaires like Elon Musk. You know, he's probably the most famous one that's
Yes.
working towards space travel. Richard Branson, a few others, and you're absolutely right. It's completely changing the name of the game. We are no longer relying on NASA. We're no longer relying on the Russian government. We're no longer reliant on the Chinese government. We're looking at sovereign businesses going in and bringing us into space. Yes. And bringing in new technologies. So what are you learning as about this new space exploration that we're looking at versus maybe what business has done and what government has done?
Well, that's actually a great question, because it is the question. Right now, we're going to see an increasing, let's say, both cooperation and also to some degree some contention between national organizations, space organizations. I'll give Mars as a good example. Obviously, NASA wants to try to lower the cost into low Earth orbit so they can put more of their budget into deep space exploration. And that's good. The idea of having reusable rockets helping to supply the ISS and bring some heavy equipment into orbit, which they can then launch into deep space, can help NASA maximize their budget. One of the things I think they're concerned about, and this is one of many things, but planetary protection, I believe is the term. The idea that if somebody starts mining or sending commercial probes down to Mars, does that contaminate the environment? In other words, if you're trying to determine whether there's some indigenous biological life, some single cellular life, you don't want to bring your own down there accidentally. And so, of course, NASA really wants to be careful, as do other space organizations, that they don't contaminate that environment. Because the question of whether there's any microbial indigenous life on Mars is a huge question about whether life in the universe is common or rare. So that you can obviously see as a bit of a tussle between the commercial imperative, which might be, hey, how can we make some money doing this and start to expand human presence in the solar system? You do that best, of course, by, well, the profit incentive and people wanting to make fortunes out there. That urges a lot of people in the same way it did in the first age of exploration. It starts this big blossoming of growth.
I mean, what's cheaper? Is it human life or robotic life? And I would say that corporations are going to want humans on the planets because you're going to get much more reliable data, probably a little bit more reliable results as well.
Yeah, but you're also going to need the human resources department down there, which you wouldn't need. So they'll have all those same meetings, but it'll just be in a different sci-fi environment. But no, I think actually we could have a whole conversation about what's called planetary chauvinism. Right. What you just talked about, this idea that we're going to be going down to these various planets and planetoids, Moon, Mars, right. And really in this book, what happened was my initial inspiration for Delta V. And by the way, does anybody here know what Delta V means? as a term. I know you know. Okay, so all delta V is a physics term that really describes a change in velocity. So if you're accelerating or decelerating, and it quickly became apparent to me how pivotal, how central this idea is to traveling in space, particularly if you're doing it commercially.
Right.
Because it's basically if you're changing everything in space is in motion. This planet is in motion, the moon, anything you send into space is moving very fast. And so in order to get there, you either have to speed up from where you are now or slow down. And then when you get there, you might have to slow down so you don't whiz past it. And that's all requires energy because you're in a vacuum. So that means money. You've got to burn fuel or something like that. And so that's why Delta V came back as a central commercial item. Excuse me, are you? Somebody's phone just went up. All right. So basically this idea that Delta V is at the heart of our future space exploration is what I wanted to get at with the title.
Absolutely. I mean, it's imperative to know what your delta V is in order to get you onto a planet, or get you onto an asteroid, or get you, near someplace where you can actually do whatever you're looking for, right?
Yes.
And in this case, in delta V, it isn't a shock that we're looking at mining.
No. Oh, this was what I was getting at. I did not come with any predetermined notion that this book was going to be about asteroid mining. What I wanted to do with Delta V was I wanted to write a book that was looking back at the fact that 50 years ago, the Apollo missions first landed on the moon. In this July is the 50th anniversary. That's half a century. And I remember thinking in 1980, around then when the space shuttle first took off, I'm like, we're on our way. Here we go. And I thought by now, 2020, thereabouts, there'd be thousands of people living and working in space. And of course there aren't. There's 6. And rotating in and out of the ISS. So I wanted to tell a story because I knew that the technology existed to do this. What was it going to take? How was it actually going to unfold? And that's what I set out to tell with Delta V. And in the research process, I was initially thinking, okay, would we colonize Mars? Would we colonize the moon? And when you start to examine the numbers, when you start to talk with economists and entrepreneurs, you start to realize that in the same way that the sailors in the first age of exploration might look at currents and trade winds and things like that, we really, for this next second age of exploration, we need to be thinking in terms of gravity wells. Looking at the solar system with the gravity depression map, because right now here on Earth, we're sitting down at the bottom of a very deep gravity well. And if you had to climb out of it by hand, that's a 4,000 mile hand over hand climb. That would be the equivalent energy to get out of this hole. So once you've taken tons and tons of equipment out of that hole, why would you then turn around and go right back into another hole? Because there are resources out there. In the case of near-Earth asteroids, and I'll name just one, the one that occurs in this book, Ryugu, which is 162173 Ryugu, is a 450 million ton rock that's got hydrates in it, it's got nitrogen, iron, nickel, ammonia, all sorts of important resources in many, many hundreds of thousands and millions of tons of it that is not at the bottom of a gravity well. So if you get out of the gravity well of Earth, it's a much, much lower energy move over to that location when it's in the right position in orbit. If you mine it, it's sort of like pulling up alongside of another object. It has 1/62,000th the gravity of Earth. If you pull the materials out of it, process them, you can send them back towards what's called cislunar space, the area around Earth and Moon, and start to use it to build truly amazing structures in space, which I think is the big issue. Because what was predicated upon Wernher von Braun's and others' ideas in space was that we would quickly start building out the area around the Earth and Moon. And we would do that by sending millions of tons of resources into space. And of course, the space shuttle was supposed to lower the launch costs. And of course, it didn't. It actually increased them. So this is what commercial space and reusable rocketry is starting to help with.
And one of the challenges, too, is a lot of the items that we're going to need for space exploration are very precious metals that we have here on Earth. And we're already using them at massive quantities for our cell phones.
Oversubscribed, let's put it that way.
Absolutely. So, I mean, what we use for our phones, the precious metals, takes, tons and tons of mining just to end up giving us our smartphone that we're looking for.
That's right. Cobalt. A lot of people don't realize that cobalt. Lithium batteries can be up to 80% cobalt. And cobalt is a rare earth metal. And again, we want to help the environment. But again, I believe it's the Democratic Republic of Congo that has about 60% of the world's supply, which makes it a very troubled area because, of course, people want that whether you want to give it up or not. There's coltan, and I'm trying to remember the rare earth metal that's in Argentina and Uruguay. But there's very certain key areas. These things are called rare earth metals for a reason. They occur in certain areas. Now, in the case of again, Ryugu, it has a lot of cobalt on it. It probably has more cobalt in that one rock than is readily available here on Earth.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating because of the fact that then we aren't tearing up the Earth, we're actually tearing up that asteroid, right? So we're not pulling out those resources.
Now, I would point out, you say tearing up the asteroid. Some people actually get upset about that. They think, why wouldn't we leave it in its pristine state? And for me, again, we're talking about an irradiated, empty vacuum that will kill you. It's literally trying to kill you every second. And if you take a look at the particular matter of asteroids and regolith, it also is deadly. And then on top of that, these near-Earth asteroids, again, they're called that for a reason. It's because they have a chance of striking Earth. And if a 450 million ton asteroid like Ryugu hit in the right spot, it could kill tens of millions of people. And it has a chance to hit the Earth within the next century. So there's that. So tearing up that asteroid, or at least redirecting it in the process of mining it, could really help us all out.
And on top of that, I'm thinking, great resources.
Yes.
And
all the building blocks you need for life.
Absolutely. Well, we talk about reusable materials right now as if, you hear Congress talking about, we should really focus on starting to go green.
Yes.
But going green costs us actually using these rare earth metals for our cars, and where are we going to get those resources? Because it's just as damaging for those green items for the earth as it is, unfortunately, for fossil fuels.
Yeah, there are still some advantages, obviously, but you do have to look at the entire supply chain for it, where you bring it from, because it's not as simple as that. Now, lithium batteries, as we've described, can be problematic. They're one of the real catalysts for me working on this book, and I'm going to mention this title. This is a book from 1976. We'll see who's heard of it. It's called The High Frontier. Has anybody read this book? Anybody? All right, I'm going to maybe blow your mind here in a second. So I love going to my own book events and touting somebody else's book. This is really great. But this was a book written by a physicist named Gerard K. O'Neill, and he wrote a nonfiction book in the 1970s. And if you remember the 1973 Arab oil crisis, when America had its oil supply cut off briefly, that was part of the catalyst for him writing that book. He had been working for a number of years on this idea of putting up into orbit these kilometer-wide solar power stations that would beam energy down to Earth. And this, again, sounds wildly sci-fi, but completely technologically possible, even back in 1977. So all of the technology to do that existed then, and it has only gotten cheaper and better since. So he and Peter Glaser, an aeronautical engineer, built this out, and he wrote the book High Frontier. NASA took it very seriously. The mainstream media, if you look back at headlines at the time, this was on mainstream news. People were talking about, we're going to do this, because people were really worried about energy supplies. Mm-hmm. And just so you know, we're talking more energy than we use now. And if anybody wants to be bored to tears, I'll be happy to go into great detail on that later. But what happened was, of course, we found new sources of fossil fuel through fracking and other drilling. And so this fell out of favor. But now if we look at the way the world's going, ironically, it was the burning of that, throwing more carbon into the atmosphere that's causing us problems now.
Yeah.
And this plan is more possible than ever. And in particular, if you use asteroid mining to, instead of launching, by the way, one of these solar satellite power stations is 80,000 tons. But if you brought that 80,000 tons from asteroids, that's a very low energy operation, and you have all of the resources you need to build them from asteroids. So you build 30,000 of those, which you can do, and you've just replaced the entire power infrastructure of Earth.
And in your book, what's fascinating is the Earth is in crisis. I mean, we really are in crisis.
Yeah, that part's actually real.
Yes. So I'm curious. It's fascinating to read through your book and discover sort of the environmental impacts. So I was curious where you got the information, what you were learning from it, who'd you speak with to end up kind of gather and give us the idea of what Earth is going to look like in, we're really looking at 14 years from now, really.
Yeah, actually, part of the research came from Change Agent. My book Change Agent takes place in roughly the year 2045, and I've done a lot of reading. I live right next to Caltech. I very often go see a lot of the proceedings, these presentations they'll give on the amount of carbon going to the air. But I'll also talk to investors. It's very interesting. A lot of people don't realize this, but BlackRock Institute, this is the largest private investor. They have $6 trillion in management. They recently put out a report indicating that they're responding to the risk of climate change. I mean, they're investing. I mean, these are very narrowly focused people, and they're looking at the risks of municipal bonds. The U.S. military, for instance, when I talk to those people, very high up is the potential for conflict due to resource shortages from changing climate. So things like that. Very often I'll go to conferences or talk to people when I'm invited to talk. It's those follow-up meetings that lead me in interesting directions.
It's a hard subject for certain people to believe
Yes.
is currently going on.
Yes.
And what do you think is the result of some of that deniability associated with climate change?
This is what I do with that. In particular with this book, is I say, if you don't believe that climate change is happening, and I personally do very much, you don't need to in this case. What I point to in Delta V is the fact that, do you want a growing economy, a growing future for young people? Because very often right now, even if you just take the climate out of it, how do you continue to grow economically without polluting or overpopulating areas? And this is really what it gets down to is Gerard K. O'Neill, when he was writing this back in the 70s, he had calculated that we could grow, if we start to expand with very large orbiting space stations, and this is not currently in my book, but the idea is you could continue to grow for up to 12,000 years just based on what we know is available in the solar system. That's at a constant level of growth, constantly having your investments grow, and that's a much brighter future, I think, for young people. The idea that there's new adventures to be had, to go up in space, to build enormous space stations, to see other planets, and that's such a better story than, about the environment, we kind of screwed that up, and things are going to get worse year over year. Good luck. That's not a good way to look into the future.
It's really kind of a depressing way to look into the future.
But I think that is very possible. I do.
It very well could be. We were talking in the back very briefly about Kim Stanley Robinson's book Aurora, and in that book you have a group of people who end up living in space for a long trip.
It's a generation ship. Yeah.
It's a generation ship. So how do you feed people? How do you clothe them? How do you survive in the vacuum of space? And in your book Delta V, you also discuss quite a bit of that. How do you survive in space? How do we believe that you can survive in space?
See, actually, we already see how we can. Now, right now, the ISS is within what's called the magnetic field of the Earth, so it has some protection, but not against galactic cosmic rays. I can go into the detail between the two different types of radiation you have, but basically it's this: a closed-loop system versus an open one. And in the ISS, it gets regular deliveries of food and air and things like that. And I think that's the major difference. If you look at Kim Stanley Robinson's book Aurora, or just about any really deep space, interstellar journey, you're not near anything. You're not going to get new arrivals of supplies. Now, again, if we're talking about colonizing deep space, building huge lavish structures in which we would live, 20-mile-long O'Neill cylinders, things like that, there would be hundreds and perhaps thousands of them. You'd be a day-and-a-half journeys from Earth. So the idea is you would constantly be bringing in new resources from asteroids and elsewhere. You don't have to make a perfect system like that. I'm trying to remember, what was the name of that place? I think it might have been in Arizona with that seal.
The biosphere.
Biosphere. See, that didn't work out well because I don't think even Earth runs like that. Earth has stuff bombarded and has all throughout its history. The idea is to constantly bring new things in. And again, this is what asteroid mining would do. So we don't have to be perfect. We just have to keep exploring and bringing new resources in. And I'd say that's the chief thing about a space economy, a cislunar economy, is you're not doing financial fun and games, let's say, to grow your economy. You are bringing real world goods and energy in. Either you're bringing in oxygen or iron or nickel or rare earth metals, or you're creating energy. You're using those materials to create solar panels, to create vast amounts of energy, which you can beam down to Earth, and which is clean. And all of that, if you look at any successful economic period in history, it is one where the availability of energy and resources is increasing. And that's what this could do.
Do you feel like business is trying to lead us towards that inevitability, that future?
I honestly think, I'm going to be circumspect as I say this, I think there's a lot of companies that are waking up to this realization that this is a tremendous opportunity, but that it's also an example of doing well while doing good. In other words, this could really help the human race. It could help us see the Earth, that we're all in this together. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the overview effect. This is a psychological reaction. It was, thank you, Frank White. Trying to remember, a lot of names in my head. But Frank White, he had interviewed a lot of astronauts. And some of these astronauts were very, conservative guys who were very, American focused. And after they came back from space, seeing with their own eyes the thin film that is our atmosphere, and that every person who had ever lived was there, all within their sight, all throughout history, it changed their view. They looked at the world very differently. And I think more people going into space can only help that. If we send thousands and hundreds of thousands of people into space, young people going up there to build huge advanced structures and coming back, it would meet people from all over the world. And they would look at the world, again, gazing out at the universe, you'd see this vast, empty universe, and then us as this jewel. I think it would foster a sense of unity.
It certainly is a humbling vision when we see photographs.
Yes.
I could just only imagine seeing it as a person.
Well, they say the photographs don't even compare. And you're right. The photographs are very powerful. So if they're saying, oh no, that's nothing, you can only imagine.
Kind of like the Grand Canyon. You look at the photo of the Grand Canyon, you're like,
That's
oh,
right.
that's a big hole.
That's right. And then when you go see it, you're standing there for like 10 minutes going, wow.
And talking about bombardment of the world, Meteor Crater here in Arizona is also another fascinating place because it is often thought of as one of the major catastrophes, or could be one of the sites of the major catastrophes that wiped out a whole level of Earth and life, And so, in terms of space exploration, originally the government, with their Star Wars program, the idea was to blow out some major asteroid. But I could see actually going in and actually mining or doing something like that is a much better solution.
Yes. And the other great thing about going out and sending people to mine asteroids and basically building a cislunar economy, lots of orbiting platforms and commodity exchanges in and around Earth orbit, is you have a lot of material and people out in space then.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going out, let's say you spend $300 billion to colonize Mars, send a few dozen people, they're down at the bottom of the gravity well of Mars. If there's an asteroid coming, they're not going to be able to do much to help you. If you have 250,000 people spread all around Earth's orbit, and they have lots of machines, they can detect it sooner, they can react sooner, and not only save the Earth, but probably profit from that asteroid as well.
It's sort of a sad idea that we don't have some of this technology out there. We only have, like you said, only 6 people out there so far.
Yes. And bear in mind that this technology exists now. In other words, we could build this now. That part is not sci-fi in the sense that it is awaiting some vast new invention. Again, if we don't have to create a perfect enclosed biome, if we can rely upon regular deliveries of new resources, we can do that now. So, yeah, it's very possible.
It's sort of an exciting time, hopefully.
All right.
How do you feel? How do you feel about this? Do you feel
Well, I feel happy
positive
you said that, because that's exactly what I'm trying to get at with this book. Is I want people to see that the future can be quite amazing, a big adventure, and can be always growing and getting better. So that's exactly what I'm trying to get at with this book.
What I've enjoyed about your books, and what I really enjoyed about Delta V, is that you make science incredibly approachable. That's a very hard job for a writer to do, and that's why you probably don't see too many writers doing techno thrillers.
Yes, and I will say this: I will really verge on, almost getting a restraining order from scientists, because I will keep pestering them. It's like, okay, am I understanding this? It's like, oh my God, yes, for the 10th time, and then they'll go through it until I understand it. And The thing is, I don't have a natural gift for understanding physics or or genetic editing. I just keep asking the dumb questions until I understand it. And I think if we get to that point where I can understand it, then I typically can help popularize it by explaining it to other people who might not have, let's say, an advanced degree in that field.
I think people struggle with science because it can be incredibly complex. I had somebody who mentioned, one of the problems with science is we're studying the number of angels that can dance on the head of the pin sometimes. What do you think is important in terms of introducing people to science and to getting them passionate about these very complex ideas? What is it that draws you to look and to research and to bring it to the layperson?
There's a lot of approaches to it. There's a lot of reasons why people should be fascinated about it. I'll give several. One is it's a new form of literacy in a way. I mean, science has a great deal of impact on how you live your life. People who master science have an advantage, and so if you don't understand how a new invention, a new innovation is going to change things, you are flotsam and jetsam floating around. You have no agency. You can't react knowledgeably. You can't be a full citizen and vote knowledgeably on things. You and I earlier talked about lethal autonomy.
Right.
This idea of robotic weapons making the decision to kill or not kill a human being. Again, it sounds like a science fiction concept, but there are two systems that are already deployed in the world that have that capability. So I hate to break this to you, we are living in a sci-fi situation right now. Many people don't realize it. And of course, sci is science. And so science is that new form of literacy that you really need to have at least a basic grasp of science to understand and be able to function in modern life and to really have some agency. So that would be the chief thing that I would say. The other thing that I would say is it's fascinating. It really endlessly is. If you really start to put together and understand the basic precepts of science, the universe becomes so amazing. It just is so cool, and one thing leads to another, and before you know it, you start to acquire a great deal of useful knowledge. It gets to be exciting.
One of your, I read an interview that you gave, and one of your big influences was Carl Sagan.
Oh yeah.
And he was by far my first introduction into science writing and Cosmos, and the librarian that I worked with gave it to me and said, this is something you really need to read. And it absolutely blew my mind. And I think that was one of your first introductions as well.
Oh yeah, it was. At least the one that I think where I really became very passionate about it. Cosmos, I just recently was looking at it, my book from 1980, that big Cosmos book. It's probably the first really serious book that I read. I mean, my parents were truly perplexed. It's like, you're literally sitting down and reading that? Yes, it's amazing. And then I watched every episode of the PBS series. He was a master at popularizing science and making it exciting to people. And I don't think it was just that he was particularly brilliant in, let's say, taking a boring subject and making it exciting. I think what he was great at was communicating his own excitement. Yeah. What excited him, because there is a reason to be excited about it, going all through the history of how these very hard-won facts were discovered, who discovered them, and how we started to assemble them into an image of what the universe and the world is. I mean, it's just amazing. It's extraordinary. So he conveyed that excitement. And certainly to me, I mean, it changed a lot about what I took in college, what I read, all sorts of things. It made things much more interesting.
It really does. I had a really wonderful professor back in college. I was a biology major. Okay. And I took a history of biology with a German scientist named Manfred Laubichler. Great name. Just
it is a great name.
Names. And he conveyed the excitement of science through these really, really, really old journal articles that we had to read, from the Victorian period and earlier, the ideas that we thought of, in terms of little people living in our sperm and things like that. And then we just grew up, and they even had a picture of a little guy in a hat.
The four humors.
Exactly, the four humors. And I'm just amazed at how fast we have moved forward with science. and
Well,
I'm
here,
wondering
think
what
about-
we're gonna turn into. What we're going to, what next are we gonna build? What next are we gonna discover was incorrect that we thought of 20 years ago, and we thought, how could we have believed that?
I'm just guessing that it's going to be that oat bran is actually bad for you. As it keeps going into this category. No. The great thing is that new evidence, you're right, is constantly, let's say, evolving how we look at things. But what new thing? I do think it's going to be a combination of genetics and aerospace. I mean, these are big, big things. By comparison, I think a lot of other things are going to seem like small realizations.
Yep, absolutely. So, what has inspired you to continue writing? What do you have next on the horizon? Or are you even there yet? Are you taking a step back as you're doing this book tour?
I'm going to continue to pursue, actually, this story. I'm writing, this is the first in a planned trilogy, because I think it's a big story. Again, I wanted to tell this story of how we bridge that chasm between where we are right now to that sci-fi future we all think about. When you see these, sci-fi series on television 300, 400, 500 years from now, how do we get there? That's really, that's the bridge I want to try to connect. So it's going to take a little while longer. I'm going to do, I think, a couple more books on this series. Because to me, it's just a fascinating subject.
We haven't even talked about your characters. We've talked about your themes,
Yes.
which is kind of hard to do. But your main character, JT, is a spelunker who ends up, getting himself into a bad situation.
Yes.
And then finds himself kind of leading a group of people.
Yeah. So in this story, JT is James Tye. He is actually a cave diver. But you're right, he is a spelunker as part of what he does. What I did for this, again, this was one of the great fun things about doing research, is I happen to know a cave diver and go to visit him and spend some time, and again, really wear out my welcome, asking lots of personal questions about how you do cave diving. Tell me the most detailed you can. And what interested me about that was I thought that unlike, let's say, a sovereign trip into space where you're going to have astronauts, people who are very good at being large inside of a large organization and excelling in a large bureaucratic structure. Of course, astronauts are a little more interesting than that. But the idea of being super speculative, very, very familiar with risk that's unquantified, where not a lot of tests have been done, who does that on a regular basis? And I started thinking about everybody from wingsuit divers to mountain climbers to cave divers. And it turns out cave diving is one of the most dangerous activities you could possibly do. Good luck getting insurance if you do that as a hobby. And what fascinated me about that is it's not only dangerous, but it is incredibly technical. You have to have a great deal of knowledge about something that's important to somebody who wants to go to space. In space, there's no real pressure. The pressure, it's a vacuum, so the way we metabolize gases with our body, it relies a lot on pressure. So when you go up higher in the atmosphere, you're subject to illnesses you don't have here and now. If you go deep into the water, the same thing. And this started me researching the fact that divers deal with this all the time. And so if they have experience, they've dealt with a life and death situation where they had to make calculations literally while they're dying. They're suffering nitrogen narcosis, which is a ruthless malady because it blurs your thinking. It makes it so you can't think clearly. So at a time like that, you're thinking, there's a problem with my machine. I have to fix it, all while your brain's going away. And I figured somebody who can deal with that level of risk just to see around the corner of a cave is exactly the type of person who would do this, to go into space, because that's the mindset you need, that sort of desire for novel experience. I believe they call it the adventurer's gene. There's a gene, and I cannot remember it off the top of my head, but that has been correlated with people who are adventure seeking, people who are skydivers and adventurers and even risk takers in business. A lot of them have this gene out of proportion to the average population.
And so he's the one who's sent to go up into space.
He's one of 8 people, yes.
Do you have a favorite character out of your entire book?
Yeah, see, that's tricky to say because it depends. I think, at least for me, and other people who write here may disagree, but for me, the character whose scene I'm writing at that time, if I've done my job correctly, they're my favorite character while I'm writing that scene. Because I really try to climb into the skin of that character and see the world through their eyes. So I would say by that measure, James Ty, simply because I spent the most time with him, because almost
Right.
all the POVs are from his point of view. But I have a great deal of fondness for all of the characters. I'm trying to be careful not to give away too much, but the reason I have a diverse cast is, again, maybe this is the old D&D player in me, but I took a look at the world and I started to realize that certain skill sets are very rare, and I just generated the probabilities to be from any part of the world, and I sort of rolled from a matrix to come up with that. And that's really how I came up with a diverse cast of people. I then knew that various of those people had to have certain skill sets. And I tried not to decide too early on who that would be. There's hundreds of people who go into the selection process in this book, and I didn't want to know too early on all but a few who were going to be in the final bid.
Did they just sort of scream out at you?
Yeah,
as you
what
were writing
happens
the book?
exactly? You start writing or examining a scene, and you start to realize this character is engaging more. I could see why they'd get rid of that one, and this one has a flaw that won't be useful there in space. That makes it very interesting for me, and hopefully that is conveyed in the writing. It keeps that excitement level up in the writing, because it's novel for me as I'm writing it.
It's a fascinating idea to think of how we would interact in such tight quarters with each
Yes.
other. And
Well,
for
think
a
about the
very long
design of the
time,
ship. The design of the ship here, and this also was one of the things that I learned in doing the research, was the vessel in this book is a spin gravity ship. But of course it's not so big that it's a complete ring. So you have 3 separate radial arms. So basically you have 3 little mini gravity wells where people can get away from each other, which I think is going to be one of the key things in space, is just the ability to get a little distance occasionally between you and your shipmates. And in this case, they use what's called a social golfer algorithm to try to maximize the unique mixing of crews in each of those halves. So it's actually 2 halves occupied at a given time, so that's 4 in each one. And you want to try to mix them up every couple weeks
to try to
keep
disperse
people from
tension.
killing each other.
Absolutely. I have no idea how they do it on this International Space Station. That's just, I think maybe a language barrier might help a little bit on occasion.
Well, again, if you talk to astronauts, you'll find that they can actually get a little privacy on the ISS. They can go into their own cocoon bag and get a little... The main issue is noise, because there's fans all over the place. Because if you're in one spot, again, heat doesn't make things go up, and carbon dioxide can build up around your head and if the air is not moving. So that's why if people on the ISS or a microgravity environment where there's not a lot of air flowing through have a long conversation, they can start getting headaches. So they got to move around. So sleeping because of all those fans, that's one of the issues. But I don't see too many people complaining too much about the crowding. The toilet they also complain about.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you have to have
It looks
some-
frightening. If you look at it, like, oh my God.
If it goes wrong, I would assume it's going to go very, very wrong.
Yeah,
very
yeah,
fast.
yeah, exactly. And you're going to have to get other people involved. It'd be embarrassing. You don't need that. If for that reason alone, spin gravity is going to be a huge blessing. It's like, we'll take the risk. Let's do it.
It'd be embarrassing to let them know what MRE you had the
You
night
don't have to
before.
let them know. But also,
Exactly.
if you Google around enough, you'll find sort of stories of floating fecal matter just winding up somewhere else in the ship. It's like, okay, whose is this? We'll do a DNA test. Anyway,
A few good tests.
that's right.
Well, should we open up some questions
Sure.
to the audience?
Sure.
Absolutely. And actually, Facebook, I'm going to come around and say goodbye because it's a little bit hard to actually, here comes Patrick, to hear the questions. So we'll see you guys soon, and we hope that you read Daniel's new book.
Please do.